Rush-Bagot Treaty was a treaty between the United States and Britain limiting naval armaments on the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain following the War of 1812. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 was a treaty between the United States and Spain in 1819 that ceded Florida to the U.S. and defined the boundary between the U.S. and New Spain. The treaty was negotiated by John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State under U.S. President James Monroe, and the Spanish Foreign Minister Luis de Onis y González Vara during the reign of King Ferdinand VII. The Texas annexation was the 1845 incorporation of the Republic of Texas into the United States of America, which was admitted to the Union as the 28th state. The Oregon Treaty is a treaty between the United Kingdom and the United States that was signed on June 15, 1846, in Washington, D.C., under the presidency of James K. Polk. This treaty brought an end to the Oregon boundary dispute by settling competing American and British claims to the Oregon country. The Mexican cession refers to lands surrendered or ceded to the United States by Mexico at the end of the Mexican War. The terms of this transfer were spelled out in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848. The Mexican cession was the third largest acquisition of territory in the U.S. history. This map shows all of the territorial gains the U.S. was able to obtain by purchasing them from other countries up until 1849.
John Quincy Adams was the son of President John Adams and the sixth U.S. President. As James Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams helped secure the Treaty of 1818 with Britain and was influential in formulating the Monroe Doctrine. Susan B. Anthony was a women's rights activist from the 1840s until the end of the century. Susie B. spoke out tirelessly against racial and gender inequality and also supported the temperance movement. Nicholas Biddle was president of the Bank of the United States during the 1820s and the 1830s. Biddle exerted significant influence over the American economy through his position. John C. Calhoun was the vice president of both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, who also led the movement to nullify the 1828 Tariff of Abominations. Henry Clay was a Kentuckian who served as Speaker of the House of Representatives, Secretary of State to John Quincy Adams, and later as a U.S. Senator. Clay was the father of the American system, which promoted higher tariffs and internal improvements at the government's expense. Ralph Waldo Emerson was an American essayist and philosopher who was one of the leading transcendentalists in the 1830s through the 1850s. Charles G. Finney was a former lawyer who applied his sharp wit and intellect to preach evangelism through the North in the 1830s. John Fremont was an American surveyor and explorer who, days after Congress declared war on Mexico, went about taking control of the territory of California. William Henry Harrison was a former governor of the Indiana Territory and an Army general who defeated Martin Van Buren in the presidential election of 1840. Harrison's election marked the beginning of an era in which the Whigs and Democrats were the two major opposing forces in American politics. Andrew Jackson was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans and the Creek War, who later entered the national political arena whenever he challenged John Quincy Adams for the presidency in 1824. Cyrus McCormick was the inventor of the mechanical mower reaper, which had an enormous impact on Western agriculture in the 1840s and 1850s. Joseph Smith was a New Yorker who founded the Mormon Church after claiming to have received a new set of Gospels from an angel. Dred Scott was a black slave who, after visiting a free state with his master, claimed that he should be free but was not granted his freedom. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist and author who's well known for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. Henry Clay was a United States Senator and House member representing Kentucky. He was also a lawyer and a politician.
The Mexican-American War was the first major conflict driven by the idea of manifest destiny, which was the belief that America had a God-given right or destiny to expand the country's borders from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. This belief would eventually cause a great deal of suffering for many Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican citizens. Texas gained its independence from Mexico in 1836. Initially, the United States declined to incorporate it into the Union, mostly because the northern political ideas were against the addition of a new slave state. The Mexican government was also encouraging border raids and warning that any attempt at annexation would lead to war. Despite Mexico's war threats, the annexation of Texas was initiated after the 1844 election of James K. Polk, who campaigned that Texas should be re-annexed and that the Oregon Territory should be reoccupied. Polk also had ideas of expansion of all of what is today the U.S. Southwest. With his offer to purchase those lands was rejected, he basically started the fight when he removed troops into the disputed zone between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River that both countries had previously recognized as part of the Mexican state of Coahuila. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a group of U.S. soldiers in the disputed zone under the command of General Zachary Taylor, killing about a dozen Mexican troops. Shortly after the American forces set up a fort along the Rio Grande, Taylor called in reinforcements and was able to defeat the Mexicans at the battles of Palo Alto and Risco de la Palma. On May 13th, Congress officially declared war despite opposition from some northern lawmakers. At this time, only about 75,000 Mexican citizens lived north of the Rio Grande. As a result, U.S. forces led by Colonel Stephen W. Kearny and Commodore Robert F. Stockton were able to conquer those lands with minimal resistance. Taylor likewise had little trouble advancing, and he captured Monterrey in September. With the losses adding up, Mexico turned to an old standby general, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the charismatic strongman who had been living in exile in Cuba. Santa Anna convinced Polk that, if allowed to return to Mexico, he would end the war on terms favorable to the United States. But when he arrived, he immediately double-crossed Polk by taking control of the Mexican army and leading it into battle. At the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847, Santa Anna suffered heavy casualties and was forced to withdraw. Despite the loss, he assumed the Mexican presidency the following month. Meanwhile, U.S. troops led by General Winfield Scott landed in Veracruz and took over the city. They then began marching toward Mexico City, essentially following the same route that Hernan Cortez followed when he invaded the Aztec Empire. The Mexicans resisted at Cerro Gordo and elsewhere, but were bested each time. In September 1847, Scott successfully laid siege to Mexico City's Chapultepec Castle. During that clash, a military group, school cadets, the so-called Niños Heroes, purportedly committed suicide rather than surrender. Guerrilla attacks against the U.S. supply lines continued, but for all intents and purposes, the war had ended. Santa Anna resigned, and the United States waited for a new government capable of negotiations to form. Finally, on February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, establishing the Rio Grande and not the Nueces River as the U.S.-Mexican border. Under the treaty, Mexico also recognized the U.S. annexation of Texas and agreed to sell California and the rest of its territory north of the Rio Grande for $15 million, plus the assumption of certain damages claims.
The North and South began to bump heads in America with different views about slavery. They both needed each other for goods and food, but began to grow apart and not as one nation. The North pushed strongly for setting all slaves free, while the Southern economy was based on the labor of slaves. The North transported all their goods by railroads, and the South mainly transported goods by river. The North picked up the skill of craftsmanship, and their economy was based on industry. While the South grew cash crops like tobacco, rice, sugarcane, and indigo, and based their economy on the labor of African slaves. As I said before, they both needed things that were essential to functions as a whole from each other. The South needed equipment and guns from the North, and the North needed the crops that the South grew. Northern economy was moving swiftly, and everyone was making money. In the South, they were only farming, and the slave population was greater than the total amount of white people. The big cities were all in the North because of the main government and industry, while the South was built of small family farms. Only 35% of America's railroads were located in the South, leaving them to a shortness of goods, unlike the North that had a greater influx. As you can now see, the North and South were quickly pulling away from each other, which will later result in the South seceding from the Union. America was slowly falling into a civil war due to the differences of opinion.